It is a genuine honour to be with you today. I'm sorry I can't stay for the rest of the evening, particularly to discuss the implications of Brexit for policing. I have to get back to Sheffield to help launch South Yorkshire's own response to a violent crime strategy, but I do wish you the best for the rest of your conference. Now, I know the police as a service can feel very lonely right now. I know that it feels like a very thin blue line. I know that you are a service that has been beaten up for 8 years by an administration that has asked you to do the impossible, has asked you to keep on doing more and more for so much less. I know that you have officers that are literally beaten, one now assaulted every 13 seconds. I know that you have suffered 8 years of so-called independent pay recommendations that have been ignored or controlled by a government, and every year receiving a real terms pay cut, whilst the politicians that make those decisions have received a substantial pay rise. It is testament to this police service and to all of you in this room and to your colleagues that you are still doing your jobs and you are part of this civilised discussion today. Because what you are being asked to do has wholly changed. As Cathy mentioned, I served as a special constable in the Metropolitan Police. I actually like to mention it quite often. I served very proudly, and it was one of the best things I've ever done. And funnily enough, even though I know there's a lot of debate around spitting at officers at the moment, I wasn't spat at until I was elected as a Labour MP. Although I was once asked out whilst doing a stop and search offer, which I politely declined. But one of the incidents that stands out most for me is a memory of a Saturday night patrol out of Kennington Police Station. I was in the response car with a PC and we were called to an incident of a man threatening to jump off Waterloo Bridge. We had to pull him down as he was halfway over the edge, and then he made for the traffic and tried to throw himself under a bus. My colleague saved that man's life that night. That is beyond doubt. He threw himself into harm's way without thinking to save a man he'd known for the best part of 10 minutes. As far as I know, he never received a bravery award, a commendation, or any particular acknowledgement. He was, in your parlance, just doing his job. We sectioned the man and took him to Maudsley Hospital, where I hope he got the support he clearly needed. And I tell you this story not because it's unique or even unusual. It's sadly very commonplace and the kind of incident that every police officer will have dealt with on numerous occasions throughout their career. But the picture now with mental health could not be more different. When I was asked to take on this job as Shadow Police Minister last summer, I thought I was on familiar territory. But I was shocked going out and speaking to frontline officers from constable up to chief constable, how much they all talked to me about the level and scale of mental health demand the police are now facing. You don't need reminding that 83% of your calls are non-crime related. People are forced to turn to the police as other services fail, and those services are failing more and more often. Sometimes the services refer directly to you. I've seen examples of GPs referring people with mental health problems directly to the police. I've been told by my own mental health trust in Sheffield to pass people with mental health problems onto the police. Just a few weeks ago, I had a woman turn up at my office in Sheffield with a noose already around her neck, having rung us 5 minutes before, telling us repeatedly that she was going to stab herself. We rang the ambulance, and it was the police who were the first to arrive. We waited for 90 minutes with the young woman and the police before an ambulance turned up. Not a bad waiting time in the current climate. But they decided it would be better to wait for the street triage car to come on at 6 p.m. So over 3 hours after she had initially turned up, she was escorted by the police in the triage car to the mental health suite in Sheffield, where it took them 10 minutes to decide she didn't meet their threshold and she was back out on the streets. Within a few hours, she was presenting at A&E, who decided not to make any further assessment because they'd just assessed her, and by the next morning, she was back on South Yorkshire Police's books as a high-risk missing person. She fortunately is now home and safe. But again, I tell you this story not because it is a unique incident, and certainly not because it is uncommon. Examples like this are happening in every shift in every police force across the country. Spaces in mental health suites are so limited that their thresholds are pushed ever higher, and as those services retreat, all of that falls back on the police. This is a service that is unrecognisable from that which existed even 6 years ago from when I served. When the Prime Minister, then Home Secretary, told the Police Federation Conference in 2010 that your job is to cut crime, nothing more, nothing less, it felt out of touch. Now it feels like a bad joke. You have become the service of first resort, the service of last resort, and everything in between. The number of vulnerable children and adults has rocketed as education funding, social care, and children's services are cut to the bare bones. Mental health services, always insufficient under any government, are in crisis. The health service, under unprecedented pressure, is creaking. This is a textbook example of whole system failure. Action that should be taken missed as the services which hold our communities together retreat. There's not many people out there who work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as you do, and so it's you that bears the brunt of this collapse. But you know as well as I do that your officers do not have the training, the skills, or the expertise to be dealing with people who are mentally unwell and who need mental health support. That is the job for the NHS. You do not have the resources for your officers to be sitting in A&E for shifts on end or driving around with unwell people in the back of your car looking for a mental health suite that will take them in, that will agree that that person is ill enough to meet their threshold. You do not have the resources to share out across high-risk missing children because our care homes are not equipped to properly safeguard them. That's the job of social services. You do not have the accountability framework that allows you to make judgments about people who are physically ill and need transport to hospital in case something goes wrong. That's the job of the ambulance service. But most of all, from the public's perspective, it is unacceptable that all unwell people can rely on is a police response. They, and you and your officers and staff, deserve better. What you are being asked to do is unacceptable and it is unsustainable. The resilience of policing is not infinite and it is being tested to its limits. That was made clear in the recent visit by President Trump. Initial requests for mutual aid could not be met. It became clear very quickly that policing across the country could not supply 300 police support units across 4 days. Forces like West Yorkshire supplied officers whilst contending with an EDL march in their own force area. The Met itself in the same weekend had anti- and pro-fascist demonstrations to deal with. My concern in those 4 days was areas of the country were simply unprotected. And you know better than anyone that those extra police forces that the public saw in Essex, London and Cambridge were nothing of the sort. They were tired, overworked men and women who had had their rest days cancelled yet again. And you, in Gold Command, some of you working for perhaps your 14th or more day in a row. Little wonder then that so many forces struggle to fill their requirements through volunteers, or any wonder that many officers are considering ripping up those PSU tickets. I said to the Minister at the time, it is simply dangerous to keep on asking our officers to do more and more without giving them the time they need to recuperate. For too long, politicians have relied on the goodwill and the can-do attitude of the police to accept these burdens and pick up the pieces where other services are failing. But the problem, it feels, is getting exponentially worse as every year goes by. Forces now receiving the same number of calls on any given day that they used to only receive on New Year's Eve. It seems to me, as I'm sure it often feels to you, that the police are the final few threads holding together the shredded fabric of our public services. So it's unsustainable if we want to continue providing a police service, because you are not able to provide the basic service that the public deserves in the face of all these pressures from other public services, from increased violent and organised crime, from terrorism, from cybercrime, from new offences like modern slavery, from the ever-increasing demands of historical and new child sexual exploitation. None of these demands are going anywhere, they're only increasing. And we can't keep asking you to meet them if we are not prepared to fund you or remove the obstacles that are preventing you from meeting those demands. And of course, it is unsustainable in terms of your own personal welfare, your mental health, and your resilience as human beings. We cannot keep asking you to do more without allowing you to recover. I know that many of you and your officers and staff are experiencing high levels of stress, are at risk of burnout, and some suffering from PTSD. This is reflected in the fact that over 10,000 officers have left the force voluntarily over the last 8 years. I routinely speak to officers who say they can't do it any longer. They've reached the absolute end of the line, and against all their deepest wishes, because they love this job, they just can't do it in the current circumstances. We can't keep doing this to you, and we can't keep recruiting officers into a system that burns them out as if they were disposable, as if they aren't human beings. The police service just cannot keep limping on as it is. And if you do not receive a significant funding settlement at the comprehensive spending review this autumn, the time will finally have come for us all to have an honest conversation with the public about what you can and can't do. So I will make no apologies for talking about resources and for fighting for the police to be given the tools you need to do your job. The Minister and the Home Secretary complain every time I get up in Parliament that they don't want to debate police officer numbers. But is it any wonder they don't want to debate police officer numbers? Because we cannot pretend that depriving you of over 21,000 officers, 18,000 staff, 6,800 PCSOs and £2.7 billion in funding has not had an impact on your ability to do your job. Every force I go to, every officer I speak to tells me the same thing. We need more resources. And of course, it's not just resources for the police, but for the NHS, for mental health care, for social care, for probation, for youth services, for all manner of early intervention measures that were the first casualty of austerity and are the reasons why we are seeing such a huge increase in violent crime. As the Home Office's own analysis that sat behind its serious violence strategy argued, not only has the reduction in neighbourhood policing contributed to the rise in violent crime, so has the increased number of school exclusions, the higher numbers of children in care, and the massively increased numbers of children that are homeless. The Children's Commissioner has shown that 70,000 young people aged up to 25 are feared to be part of a gang network, and there are as many as 2 million vulnerable children in this country in need of state support. School exclusions continue to rise and are at unacceptably high levels in many communities. I have a school in my constituency, a secondary academy, that has excluded almost a third of its students at least once. The pupil referral unit in Sheffield has a total of 120 spaces. Last year, they received over 350 children. Organised criminal gangs target places like pupil referral units because they know that the structures and the resources are not in place to keep these children safe, many of them in desperate need of help and support. But the government has washed its hands of these crises. They have nothing to say on these numbers of vulnerable children. They have no answers on social care. They keep kicking the can down the road. And they have no answers for police funding. We had to ensure that the Office for National Statistics wrapped the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister on the knuckles recently because they kept claiming that they had provided policing with £460 million of funding. They'd done no such thing, as you know. They allowed local ratepayers instead to pay more for a lesser service. And what's more, the precept is a fundamentally unfair way to fund our police services. Those police forces that have already been forced to make the greatest cuts will raise the smallest amount of money. West Midlands, which has lost 2,000 officers since 2010, will be able to raise a little over 2% of its total budget from the precept. Yet Surrey, we always use you as an example, has half the population of the West Midlands, yet will raise almost the equivalent in cash terms to the West Midlands. We need to tackle this crisis through a whole system approach, directing our collective resources and energy as early as possible. I know that all of you in this room understand this because I have spoken to many of you who talk so proudly about the work you are doing on early intervention, on adverse childhood experiences, because you understand more than anyone else the long-term effects and costs to society of not recognising and investing in problems as soon as they appear. I believe a trauma-informed approach to policing is absolutely essential if we are to stem the surge in violent crime. We need to recognise that violence is contagious and that offenders and victims are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Now, I know many of you are putting collaborations and programmes in place to ensure just that, but just as with anything in policing, we need to ensure it is consistently provided and that we deliver the absolute best practice in every community across the country. So, as I know is the subject of much of this conference this week, we need a national conversation with politicians, with the police and with the public about the mission of policing. In 2005, HMIC wrote a report that said that the model of policing wasn't fit for the demands and challenges facing policing then. I wasn't old enough to vote when that report came out, and yet little has changed since then. The problems that it laid out then have only got worse in the last decade. The pressures and vulnerabilities of public protection, of our ability to deal with organised crime, with county lines, let alone cybercrime, have been exacerbated by the reforms of the last few years and, of course, by the cuts. I don't want to see forces reinventing the wheel over and over again. I don't want to see force IT systems not talking to each other, or tablets being handed out in some forces that don't work, while just over the border they've got the latest kit going. I don't want to see victims of domestic violence receiving different treatment because of where they happen to live. It is grossly inefficient and it is unfair to the public. I want to ensure that any policy I bring forward is not reactive in its nature, just as with so much policy reform in the police, lurching from one crisis to the other, always looking behind, not forward. We need to think about what we want the police service to look like in 10, 20 years' time. And I believe that the Home Office must take its proper responsibility for the safety and security of its citizens. But there is a vacuum of political leadership from the centre as the buck has been passed to PCCs, further fragmenting the system and the service to the public. There is no vision, no model for policing in this country as we face the biggest challenges this police service has ever faced, without even mentioning the potential risk of a no-deal Brexit. Local policing is vital, as is local accountability, but the centre has to take responsibility to ensure that every victim receives the same service, and indeed, so does every offender. It shouldn't matter whether you've been a victim of domestic abuse in Camden or Cumbria, but it does. Now, that same report written in 2005 said that collaboration wouldn't work, and I know the stresses placed on you because of the challenges in those collaborations. Community safety in its broadest sense is everyone's business. We tried to entrench that in the last Labour government with the groundbreaking Crime and Disorder Act, which laid out that all agencies had their part to play alongside the police. Now, I'm not saying for a second we got everything right under the last Labour government. We were, for example, obsessed with top-down targets, which created perverse behaviours, stood in the way of justice and hollowed out leadership. And their legacy of a rigid performance culture in the police is something that still concerns me today. But we do need leadership on police reform and collaboration. And in the coming months, I want to work with you to help develop our proposals so that we can create a police service that is fit for the future. But for now, what do we do in this challenging, changed context? How do we respond? Because I know it's not enough to just talk about resources, to just talk about police officer numbers. Having listened to you and other stakeholders, I believe we need to review the inspection and accountability frameworks across public services so that when things go wrong, not all of that accountability and, yes, blame lands on the police. We need to look at the whole situation and context in the round. We need all agencies to learn the lessons when something goes wrong, and then that needs to feed into commissioning and joint agency working. We need clear expectations at a local and regional level on joint working, not tenuous, flimsy arrangements that are dependent on personalities. And we need accountability of outcomes across all agencies, something that was missing from that important Crime and Disorder Act. And I agree we need to review the structure of policing, which hasn't changed since the 1960s and isn't delivering an effective, efficient police service that is fit for this century. And I believe defending you and your work also means policy based on evidence, and that is particularly pertinent given the session we heard this afternoon on behavioural insights. We as politicians need evidence from you, and you need evidence from us if we want to introduce new legislations. We need to leave you and the courts to do your job, and we need to stop passing legislation for the sake of headlines. And it means respecting the truly independent recommendations of the PRRB, or, as I would prefer, as a trade unionists, reintroducing collective bargaining to give rank and file members a proper say. Finally, on the topic of resources, it must mean that ensuring that you have the resources you need. Real terms budget increases, and as promised in our manifesto last year, minimum staffing levels in the NHS, a better resourced social care service, and 10,000 additional neighbourhood police officers to serve every community. And let me just say finally why we focused on neighbourhood policing, and why I don't buy into the idea that policing has changed so much that we can respond with technology and everything else can be put behind the scenes into investigations and response. Yes, the success of policing is in the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action. But equally, the power of the police to fulfil their functions and duties is dependent on public approval of their existence, actions and behaviour, and on their ability to secure and maintain public respect. These were the principles laid out by Reith and Peel, and they remain true to this day, that neighbourhood policing is necessary for the police to police by consent. They are the eyes and ears of every other branch of policing, not least counter-terrorism, but they also reaffirm in every interaction that the police are the public and the public are the police. Of course, what that neighbourhood or local policing looks like is vital, and too many forces still think it's standing on a street stall or in front of a banner, when what is needed is for community officers to be community leaders, rooted in their community, responsive and adaptive to their needs. Community policing at its best means the community and police working together to tackle their joint issues and building social capital in the process. But without community policing, we turn the police into nothing more than a blue light that only arrives when the worst has happened, and we undermine a generation's work on restoring trust in the police. Now, I think the public understand all this much more than you realise. I know it probably doesn't feel like that when we see the headlines and the, quite frankly, pitiful debates that we have in the House of Commons, but the public do understand that you are working hard and doing the best in the circumstances that constrain you, the biggest of which is undeniably resources. And I understand how soul-destroying it is for you and for the officers and staff you lead to have to apologise to victims because you cannot provide them with the service they deserve. I understand what it's like to struggle to sleep at night with their faces floating in front of you because of the guilt you feel that you couldn't bring them justice. I understand that because I feel exactly the same way about my constituents when I can't get them justice, when the system simply won't allow it. I know why so many of you joined the police, because it's exactly the same reasons I joined: a sense of duty, a deep respect for our community and society, the rule of law, and because ultimately we want to protect the public. I know that for too long now, government has exploited that sense of duty, and that what we are asking you to do in 2018 is unreasonable and unsustainable. So I don't want you to be lonely. I don't want you to feel that the thin blue line is on its own, stretched to breaking point. I want you to know that I understand the pressures you face, and that as well as shouting about them from the rooftops, that I will defend you to ease those pressures so you can provide the service you want and that the public deserve. If I am the next Labour Police Minister, I will ensure that the Home Office fulfils its side of the bargain when it comes to policing this country. So in conclusion, I want to thank Gavin and Paul, who have been on my case since I was first put in post, and who come to me with challenging questions and constructive suggestions, and who are your fantastic representatives in Westminster and beyond. And I want to wish Gavin all the best in his retirement, but I'm sure that he will continue contributing to policing in a very effective way. As I develop our proposals around reform, I look forward to working closely with you all, just as I relish working with all members of the police family. And I want to thank you. I know we do it all the time as politicians, and it must feel like a bit of a kick in the teeth after what politicians have done to you over the last few years. But I hope you believe me that I mean it. Having been a victim of crime myself, particularly since being elected, I've painted a bleak picture of the service you're able to provide, but every officer I've dealt with has been dedicated, and it is nothing short of inspiring to see you, just like all your public sector colleagues in the NHS, in education, in local authorities, commit yourself with such enthusiasm in the face of such relentless challenge. I know that enthusiasm is waning. I find it desperately sad that for so many it has already waned, and we're losing so many talented and experienced people from the service. But I hope you will accept a heartfelt thank you from me for your continued commitment, and a commitment from me that I will continue to fight in Parliament and in every corner of this country for you to be able to provide the service you and the public deserve in what remains the best police force in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really stimulating and inspiring, and you spoke very passionately about the challenges for the police, and in particular you were talking about mental health from your own experience as an officer and obviously then moving into Parliament. So what I wanted to ask you was, would it not be more cost effective potentially to spend that money that you're putting into the 10,000 extra bobbies on the beat, spend that on mental health instead?
Do you know, I speak to so many officers, again, all ranks of the police all the time, and many of them will tell me, you know, if you've got money to spend, I would rather you spend it on mental health nurses or on social care. And undeniably, I would say local authorities have borne the biggest brunt of austerity. They are struggling to provide even the basic statutory responsibilities that are required of them. And anybody, I'm sure many of you, not just in your professional lives, but in your personal lives, will have had some contact with the social care system, and it is in crisis from top to bottom. So I understand that, but we have made significant commitments to the NHS, to social care, and particularly I think what's really important is that we have said we will legislate to ensure minimum safe staffing levels in the NHS, which will cover mental health trusts as well, because at the moment we are experiencing on a routine basis on wards in A&E, but also in mental health suites, those areas going below what would be deemed to be a safe staffing level.
But isn't the 10,000 bobbies on the beat, isn't that a sort of bit of a political, you know, it's playing politics, isn't it? It's a sort of, I don't know, it's a slogan rather than a serious play.
I mean, again, I get asked all the time, well, if you're going to, you know, we're not even fully reversing the cuts. It is a genuinely costed out pledge to the public and to the police service based on what we can genuinely afford. Every policy in our manifesto last year was fully costed, and I want to make sure that we build on that, and that's part of the conversation I want to have with all of you as members and as the organisation going forward about how we flesh that out. But as I said, neighbourhood policing is absolutely vital, and that was one of the major reforms and commitments of the last Labour government, and it is something that we are really losing. Not only have we lost thousands of PCSOs, but where we have neighbourhood policing teams, they are often in name only. They're being dragged into response because that is where they are needed. So we need to have some ring-fenced neighbourhood operations, and I think that needs to come as part of a wider discussion around reform of the police structure as well.
And how soon after you walk through, or Jeremy Corbyn walks through the door of number 10, how soon will those 10,000 officers be deployed?
Well, we need to recoup the tax cuts that we are funding it through reverse to capital gains tax. So this is a commitment to 10,000 that will be on the beat by the end of the next Parliament.
Right, great. Loads of brilliant questions coming in on the app, but again, do ask from the floor. You've got the Shadow Policing Minister here in front of you, so why not eyeball to eyeball, mano a mano. So what about, will Labour remove PCCs?
I knew this was going to be a question. I wasn't in Parliament when they were introduced, and Labour vociferously opposed them for a number of reasons. We were worried about politicisation of the operational day-to-day policing, and I have to say that remains a concern of mine. Politicians have got no business interfering with your day-to-day operationalisation, and your operational independence is nothing short of sacrosanct. So that still remains a concern. I look at the brilliant work that some of our PCCs are doing. Vera Baird in Northumbria, Willie Back here in Leicestershire, and I've met some Tory PCCs that are doing a really good job as well in Devon and Cornwall, Alison recently as well. So I think there are some good reforms, and I think where it works well is where a PCC gets hold of an issue like Vera has done on domestic violence and victims and driven forward collaboration and driven forward reforms there. But I have to say that I want to have a conversation with you, and I think everything will be on the table.
So you might remove them, but you might not? Right, okay. There's quite a spiky question here. The previous Labour government's gross mishandling of the country's finances led to austerity, which in turn led to a direct impact on public services. Why would it be any different if you were back in government? Where would you get the funding required to properly support the police service?
Okay, so what I want to say about that first and foremost is that there were only 3 countries in the developed world that chose to cut their police force more than we did per head after the 2008 financial crisis. They were Romania, Lithuania and Iceland, all 3 of them suffering from really, really deep depressions. Countries such as Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, all suffering from similar, if not much worse, financial crises and the impacts, the consequences for their economy than we were. They chose to continue investing in their police. So the cuts that we've experienced over the last 8 years were a choice. They were an ideological choice. They were not a necessity. We've not seen them mirrored in the US that experienced exactly the same financial crisis and exactly the same consequences. But this government and its predecessor continued to slash our public services because they don't believe in public services. Now, spending on the NHS and on schools and on social care didn't collapse our economy. Labour's mishandling of financial regulation, that absolutely contributed to it. I always hold my hand up to admit when we were wrong or are wrong now, and that is undeniably the case, that we should have regulated the banks more, and that putting the money into saving them hugely increased our national debt and allowed the Tories to make the case that the way to bring that down would be to slash our public services. But you all know we cannot continue with the service as it is, with any of our public services as it is. It is completely wrong to keep cutting our public services because we reap the costs elsewhere. It ends up coming down on the taxpayer elsewhere, and the human cost is far too much to bear.
But does all the money come from reversing capital gains tax cuts?
No, that's for the 10,000 additional neighbourhood police officers, but the money for minimum safe staffing levels and the injection into the NHS and social care.
Sorry, I meant for the police, though.
Oh, for the police, yes, that's from, that is ring-fenced from the capital gains tax.
All 300 million?
Yes.
Yeah. OK, anyone in the room have a comment on that? Anyone want to ask some questions on that? Great, here at the front, please, if you could have the mic over here, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Richard List. I'm from the Thames Valley Police. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed your speech. You talked about the arrival of the Blair government in 1997, and that was very much, obviously, community safety was one of those flagship policies, and I think most probably people in the audience would agree that was very much evidence-based. Perhaps that was the way to go. But unfortunately, within a few years, it became mired with, the need to be tough on crime, not necessarily on the causes of crime, and also there was a sort of a real need, to bring in very rigid performance frameworks, and which I think you have admitted that, and that did cause the police service a great deal of problems, problems that are still going on now. What reassurances can you give us that that won't happen again, and the Labour Party will not, if elected, fall into the same political trap?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I completely understand why you are so wary of politicians. I'm sure you've had very many opposition politicians come and tell you very similar things in the past. What I would say is that having served even just as a special, and having my family work in the criminal justice system. You know, I wrote my undergrad dissertation in 2008 on the consequences of New Labour's rigid performance culture for the police. This is something I've cared about for quite some time, and something that honestly I get pretty furious about. We're passing a piece of legislation at the moment called the Offensive Weapons Bill, and most of it is fine. But I've really pushed the government on some parts of it to demonstrate the evidence for their policy proposals and for their legislation. And most of the time the answer is, we want this to send a strong signal. Well, if you are introducing legislation that is going to deprive someone of their liberty, then it needs to be for a better reason than to send a strong signal. We want to see the evidence. And as I said earlier, we need to provide you with the evidence if we're introducing things, but we need to have a better relationship to get the evidence back from the police about what's working on the ground and what isn't. Because I think I was reflecting on it when we had the behavioural insights discussion earlier. We don't evaluate very much in an effective way in the police, and I think that was what the new Labour government were trying to do, but failed quite spectacularly at.
Good question here on the app. Is it time for a national police force? What is Labour's policy on merger and collaboration?
Well, that's exactly what I want to start the conversation on today. I'm not come with policy announcements on that, but I feel very strongly that the current model of policing isn't fit, and that proper reform is absolutely necessary to deliver an efficient, effective police force. Clearly, collaborations aren't the best way to do that. They weren't in 2005 when HMIC delivered that report, and things have only got harder for collaborations to work since then. So I want to work with you, if I may, over the next year to develop some proposals that will make the police service fighting fit.
Sounds like on a couple of questions, you know, you've sort of said, well, it's work in progress. Understandable, you're in opposition. But, you know, you could be in government within a year if things all go pear-shaped on Brexit. So are you ready?
Within a year, within a couple of months. Yeah, I mean, obviously the most important thing immediately is getting those resources in. But absolutely, you know, we need to get these policy in place. I hold up my hands that we need to get that work underway. Yeah, of course we're ready for government.
Great. Another question from the floor, if we can. Over here, the quiet corner of the room. This is the quiet corner. This is the... No? Okay. All right, just here. Thank you. There's lots on the app. In fact, we've only got a few minutes left, so get your questions in now.
David Stern, I'm the chair at West Midlands. I think you came across as a very credible politician and certainly rang a lot of bells in terms of what you said around our current issues. I do have a dilemma, though, and I know we're not allowed to be political, but I'm going to take a risk and be slightly political here. Who do I vote for at the next election?
Labour, sit down.
There is dysfunction in the Conservative Party at the top. That I would argue that there is similar dysfunction in the Labour Party at the top. So how are you going to influence the hierarchy of your party to make Labour electable from the police services perspective?
Thanks, Dave.
I think you mentioned the Tories as well in that one, actually, Baz. So you're not off the hook. Look, you know, again, I understand your concern. Neither of us are showering ourselves in glory at the moment when it comes to the two main political parties. As Shadow Police Minister, you know, it is my job to go out and talk to all you, talk to police forces of the country, and convince you that I have the credible policies, and that those were developed. Those were developed before I was Shadow Police Minister as well. They were developed for the last manifesto, that we are committed to the security and safety of this community in a way that the Tories clearly are not. 9% of all crimes ending up in an arrest or a warrant. That is completely unacceptable, and they are failing not just the police but the entire criminal justice system and victims across the country at the moment. And it seems to me that they are unwilling to deal with that crisis. So as a serving police officer, I don't see any other party that you could possibly vote for other than the Labour Party.
Has Jeremy Corbyn ever given a speech about the police? Does he care about the police?
Well, yeah, I mean, he spoke several times. That was what sort of set a lot of the narrative in the last general election, didn't it? He came out a lot, particularly in the horrific wake of the terrorist attacks. He spoke a lot about the police then and about the need for better resources, you know, on the ground.
And I mean, you know, a lot of people thought that Theresa May was sort of playing politics at that point, but I mean, the verdict of the polls immediately after that was that he couldn't be trusted on law and order. Can he now?
Of course. I mean, he has delivered in his manifesto last year 10,000 additional officers, and that conversation remains open as to what additional we will be delivering. That's not something we'll be rowing back on. That's something that we will be fleshing out. And he has asked me to be his spokesperson on the police. So he obviously values, frontline experience to be able to go out and do that and have this conversation with the police family.
Is it time for a royal commission to consider what the role of contemporary policing is? That way, taking party politics out of the debate, brackets, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, I know I get this request all the time. A royal commission takes years, years and years and years. I think we know the conversation that we need to have with the public. We know the conversation that we need to have with you. I'd like to think that we can do that in government, and we can deliver the structures and the model of policing that is needed to tackle the vastly changed picture of crime and vulnerabilities that exist in 2018 and that will exist in the next 10 to 20 years. I don't think a royal commission is necessary for that.